The Dawson estate glowed like a cathedral of wealth on the night of Richard Dawson's 60th birthday. Chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors, polished until they reflected every jewel and every polished shoe. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne, and the pianist filled the air with music that whispered of old money and power. Guests in gowns and tuxedos gathered to toast Richard, but beneath the surface of elegance, a storm brewed at the top of the grand staircase. Lily Dawson, 27, in a simple blue dress borrowed from a friend, tried to steady her breath as her older sister Sophia leaned close. Sophia's perfume mixed with the sharpness of her words. She told Lily to stay in the background to smile, but remain invisible that this was Richard's night and their family image mattered more than her existence. Lily's cheeks burned, but she whispered back that she too belonged here, that she was his daughter, not some ghost. Sophia's eyes narrowed, green stones flashing under the chandelier, and she answered not with words, but with action. In one swift motion, she shoved Lily hard. The world tilted as Lily's heels slipped against the polished wood. Guests gasped as the pianist struck a discordant note. Glasses froze halfway to lips, and then Lily crashed down the staircase. Her head hit the edge of a step with a sickening crack, her body tumbling until she sprawled on the marble below. A pool of red began to spread beneath her head. The crowd erupted in gasps and horrified whispers. One woman clutched her pearls, another moved as if to call for help. But Margaret Dawson's voice rang out cold and commanding, ordering everyone to stay calm. "It was an accident," she said sharply. "These things happen. Continue with the party." The pianist, trembling, resumed the music, forcing melody into a silence thick with dread. Richard's face darkened. He barked that no one was to call 911, that there would be no scandal on his birthday. The guests hesitated, torn between decency and fear of crossing the powerful host. Lily lay broken, struggling to breathe, each inhale shallow and ragged. Her vision blurred, but she could still make out faces above her, the faces of people she had known her whole life. Not one bent to help. Sophia descended slowly, her gown flowing like a serpent. She crouched near Lily's ear and whispered a sentence that cut deeper than the wound on her head. "You should have stayed hidden. Now everyone sees how pathetic you are." She stood again, raising her glass as though nothing had happened. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved. Lily tried to lift her hand to speak, but her body betrayed her. Blood dripped warm against her skin. She heard Margaret hiss to Richard that Lily always ruined things, that she had been a burden since birth. Richard's jaw tightened as he replied that appearances must be preserved at all costs. They stepped away, leaving their daughter gasping on the floor. The humiliation and betrayal seared hotter than the pain. In the shadows of the hall, a younger man slipped his phone from his pocket. His hand shook as he whispered to the dispatcher, describing a young woman bleeding, nearly unconscious family refusing help. The dispatcher's voice pressed with urgent questions, and the man whispered answers before ending the call quickly, fear etched in his face. Minutes stretched into eternity until faint sirens pierced the night. Richard cursed and ordered the staff to keep the doors closed, but the medics forced their way inside, cutting through the stunned silence. They dropped to their knees beside Lily, shining lights into her pupils, checking her pulse, noting her Glasgow Coma Scale score at 6, dangerously low. Possible closed head injury, risk of internal bleeding, one medic reported briskly. They slid a collar around her neck, lifted her carefully onto a stretcher, and wheeled her toward the waiting ambulance. The crowd parted eyes wide, but Richard's glare pinned them all into silence. Sophia sipped her champagne unbothered, while Margaret muttered that Lily always found ways to steal attention. Inside the ambulance, the medics worked with fierce urgency. They recorded vital signs, connected her to monitors, and prepared for intubation. Lily drifted in and out, the edges of consciousness dissolving. She remembered Sophia's smile as she fell. She remembered her mother's cold command. She remembered her father's order forbidding anyone to help. The betrayal pressed heavier than her broken body. Suddenly, one medic shouted that her heart rhythm was crashing. They prepared the defibrillator sticky pads placed against her chest. Her body jolted with the shock. For a moment there was nothing, no pulse, no breath. "She's dead!" The lead medic cried, his voice sharp as a verdict. Darkness swallowed her, but another medic injected epinephrine. Another prepared a second shock. Her body convulsed, and then a thin line appeared on the monitor, weak but present. Gasps of relief filled the ambulance. Lily's eyes flickered open for a fleeting second, seeing the ceiling lights blur above her, hearing the medic's voice steady again as he announced return of spontaneous circulation. She was alive, but she understood with cold clarity that she had truly died for a moment, and that her family had chosen to let it happen. As the ambulance raced toward the hospital, she felt a vow form deep inside her. If she survived, she would not forgive. She would rise, she would remember, and she would one day force them to face what they had done. The party music still played behind her, hollow notes echoing through the Dawson estate, but Lily knew the night had already changed everything. She was no longer just the forgotten daughter. She was the survivor who had been left for dead, and she would not stay silent. When Lily opened her eyes again in the sterile brightness of the hospital, memories came rushing like a tide she could not hold back. The pain in her ribs and the bandage around her head were only the latest chapters of a lifetime that had been carved by cruelty long before the fall at the gala. She had lived in the Dawson house for 27 years, and every corner of that house carried echoes of violence and contempt. As a child, Lily had been taught that love in her family was conditional. Richard Dawson, a man who ran his business empire with an iron fist, ruled his household with the same severity. When Lily was 7, she spilled a glass of milk on the dining table during a Sunday breakfast. Richard's eyes had burned through her before he stood unbuckled his leather belt and struck her across the legs while Margaret watched. Margaret did not stop him. Instead, she reminded Lily that discipline was necessary, that mistakes had consequences, and that Sophia never embarrassed them like that. Sophia, only 9 at the time, smirked from across the table. That smirk would become a constant companion in Lily's life. Years later, when Lily was 12, she came home from school with a certificate for perfect attendance and an essay contest ribbon. She placed them proudly on the kitchen counter, waiting for acknowledgement. Margaret barely glanced before sweeping them aside to make room for Sophia's new cheerleading trophies. Sophia's photograph was framed and hung in the living room, while Lily's accomplishments were tucked away in drawers. Margaret told her again and again that Sophia was the future, the shining star of the family. Lily was the reminder of weakness, too quiet, too soft, too much like her grandmother, whom Richard despised. The cruelty escalated when the sisters reached their teenage years. At 17, Sophia cornered Lily in the bathroom after a fight over borrowed clothes. She pushed Lily's head down into the sink, holding her under cold water while laughing. Lily choked and clawed, but when she told her parents later, they dismissed it. Richard said girls bicker, and Margaret said Lily was dramatic. Sophia thrived under the protection of their denial, learning that she could wound her sister without consequence. In the Dawson household, violence was either ignored or reframed as discipline. Psychological control wrapped around Lily as tightly as any physical blow. Richard held the family trust in his iron grip, and when Lily turned 21, he forced her to sign papers she barely understood. He called it a simple matter of estate planning, but she later realized she had signed away any independent claim to assets, placing her inheritance under conditions that favored Sophia. Richard told her bluntly that Sophia knew how to manage wealth and that Lily would squander it on sentimental nonsense like children's charities. Margaret nodded in agreement, reminding Lily that the family's name and power rested with Sophia. The message was clear. Lily existed to obey, to serve the image, not to shape her own destiny. That control bled into every decision of her life. When Lily graduated college with a degree in education, she wanted to work in underfunded schools to help children who reminded her of herself, unseen and dismissed. Richard laughed at the idea. He called it a hobby, not a career, and told her she would regret throwing away her future for the sake of children who were not her responsibility. Margaret told her she was selfish for choosing a path that would never bring honor to the family name. Sophia called her pathetic for choosing a salary that could barely cover rent when she could have leveraged the family connections for corporate positions and luxury apartments. Yet Lily persisted. For 3 years, she worked at an elementary school in Bridgeport, tutoring children who struggled with reading, running after-school programs with donated books, and walking home at night past boarded windows and cracked sidewalks. She carried within her the memory of every child's smile when letters finally formed words, when reading became a bridge instead of a wall. It gave her life meaning even as her family sneered. She remembered the night she came home late from the school library where she had been planning a literacy fundraiser. Richard was waiting in his study, the smell of bourbon thick in the air. He told her she had embarrassed him by being seen in cheap neighborhoods, that donors had asked questions about why his daughter wasted her time with people who would never matter. His voice grew louder until it thundered that she was no daughter of his if she kept making these choices. Margaret appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, saying quietly that Sophia never gave them this kind of shame. Lily stood there small and trembling, clutching her bag of lesson plans, and realized she was a stranger in her own home. The memories bled together, one wound reopening another. The gala fall was not an isolated act of violence. It was the culmination of years of dismissal, humiliation, and open hostility. Sophia had been trained by their parents to see Lily as disposable, a foil against which her own brilliance shone brighter. Margaret's cold words of preference, Richard's lash of control, Sophia's cruel laughter, they formed a cage Lily had lived in her entire life. And yet, even as these memories pressed on her in the hospital bed, another memory surfaced, one that twisted the knife deeper. It was 2 years ago when Richard had called both daughters into his office to discuss the future of the family trust. The walls smelled of leather and cigar smoke, the desk stacked with papers. He told Lily to sign documents that would finalize Sophia's control over the majority of family assets, promising her a modest stipend if she cooperated. Lily hesitated, her voice small but steady, as she asked why Sophia should control everything. Richard leaned back, eyes cold, and said, because Sophia was ruthless, and ruthlessness was survival. Margaret added softly that Lily's compassion was weakness, and weakness had no place in a family that valued dominance. Under their gaze, Lily signed her hand, trembling. The pen might as well have been a chain locking her future. Lying now in the hospital bed, she could see the connection as clearly as the scars on her body. Every humiliation, every slap of neglect, every calculated betrayal had built to the moment Sophia pushed her down the stairs. It was never a sudden act of rage. It was the inevitable conclusion of a system that had decided long ago that one daughter deserved everything and the other deserved nothing. Lily closed her eyes, the beeping monitor steady at her side, and let the memories burn inside her. For years, she had accepted it, told herself to endure, to avoid confrontation. But the echo of the medic's voice, "She's dead," had changed something fundamental. They had left her to die, and she had died for a moment. That death stripped away any illusion that she could survive quietly. She had been resurrected not only to breathe again, but to confront the entire history of her family's cruelty. She understood that justice was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was necessary. And it would begin with remembering every scar and using them as weapons of truth. The hospital lights faded in Lily's memory as the vision of the gala returned sharp and merciless. Even as she lay in the bed, the scenes replayed in her mind, each detail etched like a scar. After the shove that sent her tumbling, after the silence that followed, after the whispered commands from her parents to hide the truth, the violence did not stop. What burned most was not the fall itself, but the spectacle that followed, the deliberate cruelty that unfolded before an audience. Lily had tried to move, to push herself up on trembling arms, but pain seared through her ribs. Blood soaked the fabric of her dress, dripping down her cheek. The gasps of guests echoed above her, yet no hand reached for hers. Sophia stood a few feet away, eyes gleaming, lips curved in a smile she did not bother to hide. "Always so dramatic," Sophia said loudly enough for others to hear her tone, mocking her hand raised in a gesture of dismissal. "She just wants attention." A ripple of nervous laughter trickled through the crowd, forced and awkward, as if some of the guests were unsure whether to react with horror or compliance. A man in a tuxedo reached out as if to help, but Sophia slapped his hand away with a flourish, whispering through clenched teeth, "Do not make this worse." Cameras from the party's hired crew captured the entire moment, but the family believed their authority would keep any footage contained. Richard scanned the room, his eyes daring anyone to disobey him. He reminded the guests that accidents happen, that Lily was clumsy, that no spectacle was needed. Margaret smoothed her gown and told the pianist to keep playing. The music faltered, resumed, faltered again. Guests shifted uneasily, torn between conscience and fear. Lily's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Her vision tunneled, but she could still hear. She heard Sophia's sharp laughter. She heard Margaret hiss that Lily always spoiled evenings. She heard Richard's growl that no police should be involved. And then she heard the quietest sound of all, a phone call being made in secret. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a young guest whispered into his phone, his voice shaking as he answered the dispatcher's questions. He risked Richard's wrath to save her life. Lily clung to that faint sound as proof that someone, even a stranger, still saw her as human. Minutes later, the sirens arrived. The doors burst open and paramedics rushed inside. The sight of them was a lifeline, but Richard tried to block their way. He argued that it was unnecessary, that they were overreacting. One medic ignored him and dropped to Lily's side, calling for vitals, shining a penlight into her eyes. Pupils sluggish, GCS 6, he reported. Possible skull fracture, rib trauma. They lifted her carefully, strapping her to a stretcher, fitting a cervical collar around her neck. Margaret gasped theatrically for the crowd's benefit, but her words were poison. "See what she does! She ruins everything!" The guests whispered, their eyes darting between the bleeding young woman and the parents who refused to help her. The scene was no longer just a fall. It was a public revelation of who the Dawsons truly were. As Lily was carried out, Sophia followed behind for a moment. She bent down close enough for only Lily to hear and whispered, "Next time, stay down." Her laugh was low and cruel, the last sound Lily heard before the ambulance doors slammed shut. In the back of the vehicle, chaos reigned. Monitors beeped, gloved hands moved quickly. Oxygen was delivered through a mask. A medic pressed against Lily's chest, counting out compressions as her pulse faded. "We are losing her," one voice said. "Get the defibrillator ready," another ordered. Pads were placed, the jolt surged through her body, and then came the words that cut deeper than the fall. "She's dead," the medic declared, his voice stark. For an instant, Lily's body lay still lifeless, and the world seemed to agree with her family's verdict that she was disposable. But then came a second shock, another injection of epinephrine, and her chest heaved. A faint rhythm returned on the screen, a fragile line between death and survival. She gasped, eyes fluttering, the ceiling lights blurring above her. She had been pulled back. The violence of the gala had nearly ended her life, but fate had given her one more chance. She thought of the guests who had watched the pianist who had played through his terror, the guests who had laughed nervously at Sophia's cruelty, and the one man who had made the secret call that saved her. She realized the truth in that ambulance her family had left her for dead, but strangers had chosen to save her. Back at the gala, even as the ambulance disappeared down the driveway, Richard ordered the butler to open more wine. He told the guests to enjoy themselves, to forget the spectacle, to remember only his 60th year of triumph. Sophia raised her glass in silent victory. Margaret leaned close to her husband and whispered that Lily always sought attention, that she would use this to embarrass them if she survived. They laughed softly, confident that the story would never reach beyond the walls of their mansion. They did not know that cameras had already caught Sophia pushing Lily aside when a guest tried to help. They did not know that the audio of Margaret's command to keep quiet had been recorded. They did not know that their daughter, the one they had dismissed as pathetic, had lived. The gala would be remembered not for Richard's 60th birthday, but for the night the Dawson family revealed their cruelty to the world. In the hospital, Lily would come to understand that survival alone was not enough. The violence had been public, the humiliation had been deliberate. And justice would need to be just as public, just as deliberate, until everyone who watched her bleed in silence would hear the truth of what had been done. The sterile white of the ICU was nothing like the golden glow of the Dawson estate. The walls smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic, and the constant beeping of monitors was the only music Lily heard now. She opened her eyes slowly, vision blurred, throat raw from the oxygen tube that had been removed hours earlier. A nurse leaned over her, shining a penlight into her pupils, calling her name softly. "Lily, can you hear me?" Her lips cracked as she whispered yes. The nurse smiled gently and noted the response on a chart clipped to the bed. Machines hummed around her, tracking pulse oxygen saturation and blood pressure. Her head throbbed with every beat of her heart, a dull pain radiating down her neck. She tried to move, but her ribs screamed in protest. A CT scan had confirmed 2 fractures and a concussion. Later that day, an MRI was ordered to rule out intracranial bleeding. Dr. Samuel Green, the attending physician who had revived her in the ambulance, entered the room. His expression was firm but kind, his eyes lined with exhaustion but softened by relief. He told her she had been lucky. She had suffered a severe concussion, a fractured rib cage, and temporary cardiac arrest. He explained that her heart had stopped for 8 seconds and that he had declared her clinically dead before the defibrillator and epinephrine brought her back. His voice carried both professional detachment and a trace of disbelief, as though even he could not forget shouting those words. "You came back," he said quietly. "Most do not." Lily swallowed hard tears, stinging her eyes. "They left me there," she whispered. Dr. Green looked at her for a long moment. He did not press, but he made a note in the chart and said softly, "We have mandatory reporting procedures. If a physician suspects abuse or neglect, we notify social work and, if necessary, law enforcement. That process has already begun." A nurse named Emily Carter returned with fresh bandages and a clipboard. She spoke to Lily gently while adjusting the IV line. Emily told her that in Connecticut, medical staff are mandated reporters in suspected cases of domestic or family violence. Her injuries, the delay in care, and the witness reports had already raised red flags. A hospital social worker had been contacted. Lily felt her chest tighten not only from the broken ribs but from fear. She knew what her parents would say. They would claim she had tripped, that she was clumsy, that she had been drinking. They had always controlled the narrative. Emily, noticing the fear in her patient's eyes, leaned closer and whispered, "You have rights. Your medical records are protected under HIPAA. You can request copies. If you want to share them with police or a lawyer, you can." Lily stared at her, the weight of those words settling in. For the first time, she realized the medical evidence of her injuries could not be erased by her family's influence. Blood tests, scans, physician notes, cardiac arrest logs. These were truths written in ink and science not in her parents' version of events. Over the next days, Lily drifted in and out of consciousness. She woke to the sound of machines, to the touch of nurses adjusting her oxygen, to the sting of IV needles. She overheard fragments of conversation. A resident noted that her injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. Another nurse mentioned to Dr. Green that a guest from the gala had already called to provide a statement about being ordered not to call 911. Each word fed into Lily's growing realization that her survival was no longer private. The world beyond the Dawson mansion was beginning to take notice. On the second evening, Margaret appeared at her bedside. Her pearls gleamed against the hospital's fluorescent lights, her smile as brittle as glass. "You frightened everyone," Margaret said, voice low and sharp. "If you tell anyone this was more than an accident, you will destroy this family." Lily lay still, but her fingers pressed to the bedrail. Margaret leaned closer. "If you open your mouth, we will say you were drunk. We will say you slipped because you cannot control yourself. Do not be foolish." Sophia entered moments later, her heels clicking against the tile. She bent down so only Lily could hear her words. "You embarrassed us. Next time, stay dead." Then she straightened, kissed the air near Margaret's cheek, and walked out with a laugh. Emily Carter had been standing near the doorway, chart in hand. She said nothing as the Dawsons left, but her eyes told Lily she had heard. Later that night, Emily returned, slipping into the room quietly. She placed a small digital recorder on Lily's bedside tray. "Connecticut is a one-party consent state," she whispered. "If they come back and threaten you again, you can record. It is admissible evidence." Lily stared at the device, her mind spinning. She had spent her life silenced, her voice drowned out by the authority of her family. Now she had been given a way to preserve truth no one could dismiss. Her ribs ached as she lifted the recorder and held it in her palm. She realized she was holding a weapon as powerful as any. Dr. Green came again in the morning to review her scans. He explained the CT showed no bleeding but confirmed concussion. The MRI ruled out severe brain damage but noted swelling. He told her she would need monitoring pain management and weeks of recovery. He also said the hospital had flagged her case for potential criminal investigation because the delay in calling emergency services may have worsened her injuries. His words were clinical, but Lily felt them land like stones. For years, she had begged for someone to believe her. Now, through the objective eye of medicine and law, the truth of neglect and violence was being documented. She began to cry quietly at first, then with deep sobs that shook her fragile body. Emily placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You are not alone anymore." Lily thought of the medic's words in the ambulance. "She's dead." She had been declared gone, erased. But she had returned, and with every beat of her heart, the chance for justice grew louder. Her parents had left her bleeding. Her sister had mocked her survival. But the machines, the charts, the scans, the recordings, these stood as proof no Dawson command could erase. In the stillness of that ICU, Lily understood something profound. Her death had already happened. What came next would be her resurrection not only into life, but into defiance. She would no longer beg for her family's recognition. She would demand the world see what had been done, and she would use every medical record, every legal statute, every breath she had to make sure they paid for leaving her behind. The days after the fall blurred into each other, but within that blur, Lily found clarity. The pain was constant, a throb in her ribs, a pounding in her skull, but beneath it all, a new resolve was forming. She had been left for dead, declared gone, and then pulled back into life. That second chance demanded more than survival. It demanded action. Emily Carter became more than a nurse. She became a quiet ally. One evening, she sat by Lily's bed and explained that under HIPAA privacy rules, Lily could request her full medical file. Every scan, every note, every report would belong to her. Emily whispered that those records could be critical if Lily chose to go to the police. Lily listened, fear tightening her chest, but she nodded. For the first time, she realized she could hold proof in her hands, not just memories that her family would deny. Margaret and Sophia returned the next morning, walking into the ICU as though it were a stage. Margaret scolded her for making a scene at the gala. Sophia leaned close with that same cruel smirk. "Next time, remember to stay down," she whispered. Lily felt the recorder Emily had given her hidden under the blanket. She pressed the button. The red light blinked quietly while her mother threatened to disown her if she spoke, and Sophia told her she should have died. Their voices filled the room sharp, undeniable, and preserved forever. Later, when they left, Lily pulled the device out and stared at it with shaking hands. It was small, ordinary, yet it held power greater than any Dawson secret. That night, she used her phone to transfer the file, labeling it simply, Truth One. She felt her ribs ache as she moved, but pain no longer mattered. She was building a case. On the third day, she asked Emily to help her photograph her injuries. The bruises on her ribs were deep shades of purple and black. The laceration on her forehead, stitched neatly by Dr. Green, still looked raw. Emily angled the hospital clock into the frame for time stamping, then included the medical ID bracelet visible on Lily's wrist. Evidence had to be precise. Each photo was stored in Lily's phone and then backed up to a cloud account Sophia could not touch. In the quiet hours of night, Lily wrote in a notebook Emily had given her. She described the shove on the staircase, the laughter afterward, the commands to keep guests silent, her parents refusing to call 911. Sophia's whisper in the ICU. She wrote it all, date and time, every detail. It was a victim's journal, but also a timeline of accountability. She knew courts valued contemporaneous records. Each entry was another stone in the wall she was building against her family. A few days later, she reached out to David Miller, a journalist she had once tutored with during college. He now worked at a regional newspaper covering politics and crime. Using her phone, she sent him a message that read, simply, "I have a story, I have proof." He came the next afternoon, walking cautiously into her hospital room. His eyes widened when he saw her injuries. She told him everything, voice-breaking, but steady enough to be believed. Then she played the recording. The words from Margaret and Sophia filled the room, undeniable in their cruelty. David's face hardened. "In Connecticut, it is legal to record if one party consents," he said. "This is admissible. Combined with your medical records, this is powerful." He promised he would help, but warned her that publishing meant exposure. Lily nodded. She was past fear. Exposure was exactly what she wanted. She gave him copies of the files, the audio, and the photographs. She authorized him to request her medical chart officially once she signed the HIPAA release form. The machinery of truth was moving now beyond her family's reach. That evening, Emily told her detectives might come soon. The hospital had filed a mandatory report, and the police would be required to follow up. Lily braced herself. She remembered Richard's voice at the gala forbidding anyone to call 911. His glare daring anyone to defy him. For the first time, she was glad someone had defied him. The next morning, detectives arrived plainclothes but serious. They introduced themselves as Detective Harris and Detective Alvarez from the Fairfield County Police Department. They asked her to recount what happened, and she gave them every detail she had already written. She showed them the photos, handed over the recording, and signed the victim impact statement they provided. She watched as they logged her evidence carefully, each step following procedure. For once, the rules were on her side. Harris told her the footage from the gala security cameras had already been requested. Alvarez assured her that Dr. Green's medical testimony would be essential, especially his declaration of clinical death. They promised her she would not stand alone. After they left, Lily lay back exhausted but lighter. For years, her family's word had been law. Now, the law itself was listening to her. That evening, David called. His voice was steady, professional, but underneath, she heard the urgency. "The story is going live tonight," he said. Headline: "Teacher left for dead by family at gala." Her breath caught. "It will have the audio," he continued, "and your name if you approve." Lily closed her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Use my name. I am done hiding." That night, the article spread quickly. The recording played on local news websites. Hashtags bloomed across social media, #justice, for Lily, climbing into the top ranks. Strangers posted messages of outrage, of support, of disbelief that a family with power and money would abandon their own daughter in blood. Lily scrolled through the messages, tears streaking her face. She had been invisible all her life. Now she was seen. Margaret called the hospital in fury. Sophia posted a statement online insisting the recording was fabricated. Richard threatened legal action against the paper. But the video from the hospital cameras soon leaked. It showed Lily on the floor of the gala bleeding unattended while her parents stood nearby drinking champagne. That image spread faster than any denial could erase. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict before any judge had spoken. In the quiet of her hospital room, Lily felt a surge of strength unlike anything she had known. She had been left for dead, but she had brought herself back with evidence, with truth. Each photo, each file, each word recorded was a weapon against the silence that had smothered her for years. The gathering of evidence was more than a legal strategy. It was an act of defiance. It was her resurrection made visible to the world. She pressed the recorder to her chest, whispered to herself, "They cannot bury me again." By the time dawn broke the morning after the article was published, the name, Lily Dawson, was on every screen. What began as a local news story had spread across the internet like wildfire. The headline was everywhere: "Teacher left for dead by family at gala." The audio clip, harsh and undeniable, played on radio stations and cable networks. Margaret's cold warning and Sophia's cruel whisper were replayed until they became infamous lines, symbols of heartless privilege. Strangers who had never met Lily spoke her name with outrage and sympathy. For the first time in her life, the world saw what her family had always tried to hide. Lily sat upright in her hospital bed, a pillow bracing her fractured ribs, as the television above her displayed the footage that had leaked overnight. The camera showed her bleeding on the marble floor of the mansion guests, shifting uncomfortably. Margaret sipping her wine, Richard ordering silence. Then came Sophia's dismissive laughter. The clip cut to Dr. Green's testimony to the press confirming that Lily had been clinically dead for 8 seconds. The juxtaposition was devastating. The comments online exploded. Thousands of messages flooded the hashtags #HowIJustice4Lily and #ProtectSurvivors. Teachers from across the country wrote about how one of their own had been nearly erased by her own bloodline. Survivors of domestic violence shared their stories tagging Lily's name, promising solidarity. Even political figures began to weigh in, demanding accountability for families who believed wealth could shield them from the law. Lily scrolled through the messages, slowly tears streaming down her face. Every word of support countered years of silence. For every cruel dismissal she had endured at home, there were now 100 strangers calling her brave, strong, unbroken. The emotional weight was overwhelming. Emily Carter, the nurse who had become her quiet protector, entered with breakfast and set it on the tray. She watched the screen for a moment, her lips pressed tightly before turning to Lily. "They cannot hide anymore," Emily said softly. "The world is watching now." Within hours, reporters camped outside the hospital. Police officers were stationed in the lobby not only to control the crowd, but also because threats had begun to arrive. Margaret and Richard were furious, issuing statements through their lawyers. They claimed the article distorted events, that Lily had exaggerated, that the recording was fake. But the footage from the hospital cameras, the leaked call logs from 911 dispatch, and the medical reports destroyed their narrative. The louder they protested, the more foolish they looked. Sophia attempted damage control by holding a press conference in front of Hartwell Industries headquarters. She appeared in a sleek black suit, her hair perfectly styled, her voice rehearsed. She declared her love for her sister, insisted the fall was an accident, and condemned the media for exploiting private family matters. For a moment, some cameras captured sympathetic angles. But then a reporter played the recording aloud in front of her, Sophia's own voice, sneering, "Next time, remember to stay down." Her face faltered, her polished smile cracking into visible rage. The clip was replayed endlessly. Her credibility collapsed before millions. The backlash was immediate. Corporate sponsors pulled partnerships with Hartwell Industries. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Neighbors whispered about the Dawsons in disgust. What had once been a fortress of wealth and reputation was crumbling. In the hospital, detectives returned to take formal statements. They explained to Lily that preliminary charges were being drafted. Sophia would face attempted murder in the first degree. Richard and Margaret would face reckless endangerment and neglect. The officers provided her with a victim impact statement form, telling her she could describe how the assault and neglect had affected her physically, emotionally, and financially. She took the form in trembling hands and realized her words would help decide her family's fate. For hours she wrote. She described the fear of lying on the cold marble, hearing her parents laugh while her blood pooled. She described the despair when the medic declared her dead, and the defiance that grew when she was shocked back into life. Every sentence poured out like years of silenced truth finally finding voice. Meanwhile, David Miller, the journalist who had first broken the story, became a national name overnight. He called Lily often to update her, explaining that major outlets like CNN and the New York Times had picked up the case. He told her that survivors around the country were writing editorials citing her courage as a turning point. Lily listened in disbelief. She had been invisible all her life, told she was pathetic, told she was nothing. Now her name had become a symbol of resistance. The emotional undulation hit her again. She wept with gratitude, then trembled with fear. She worried what retaliation her family might attempt. Emily reassured her that hospital security was tight, that the police were watching, that she was no longer defenseless. The most haunting moment came when Lily saw a trending image online. It was a split screen. On one side, she was shown lying bleeding at the gala, eyes half closed. On the other side, she was pictured sitting up in her hospital bed, bruised but alive, holding a notebook in her lap. The caption read, "She died. She returned. She will speak." The image was shared tens of thousands of times. Lily stared at it for a long while. The words were simple but true. She had died, she had returned, and she would speak. Her survival was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. The Dawsons tried to retaliate by filing a lawsuit against David's paper for defamation. But within 24 hours, the suit was dismissed as frivolous because the evidence was overwhelming. The court of public opinion had already buried them. Every step her family took only deepened the hole they had dug for themselves. One evening, Detective Alvarez returned to the hospital with an update. The state attorney's office was preparing charges. There would be a preliminary hearing soon. Alvarez told her that the public exposure had ensured transparency. "No one can sweep this under the rug," he said. "Not anymore." Lily nodded slowly, gripping the blanket. She felt fear, yes, but also relief. For the first time, the law was on her side. As night fell and the hospital quieted, Emily sat by her bed. She whispered that she had seen many survivors, but few who had endured abandonment as Lily had. "You are alive because you fought," Emily said. "Now you must decide what to do with that life." Lily thought of the cameras, the hashtags, the strangers calling her brave. She thought of Sophia's twisted smile and her mother's cold pearls. She thought of the medic shouting she's dead and the shock that brought her back. Her voice was hoarse but steady as she replied, "I will not let them bury me again. I will not." The exposure had begun as humiliation. It had transformed into vindication, and soon it would become justice. The courthouse in Bridgeport, Connecticut was an austere granite building that had seen generations of justice unfold inside its walls. On the morning of Sophia Dawson's preliminary hearing, the steps outside were lined with reporters' cameras flashing as soon as Lily's name was mentioned. Protesters held signs with words scrawled in black ink, "Justice for Lily, believe, survivors, no more silence." Inside, the marble corridors echoed with the shuffle of lawyers and the clipped heels of court clerks. Lily entered through a side door, escorted by Detectives Harris and Alvarez. She wore a simple navy dress and a medical brace under her clothes to support her ribs. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the faint scar on her forehead from the fall. Every step inside the courthouse felt heavier than the last, but she carried herself upright, determined. In the courtroom, Sophia sat at the defense table in a tailored gray suit, her posture straight, her jaw clenched. Her parents flanked her, Richard whispering to a lawyer, Margaret dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief as though she were the victim. Their legal team filled 2 full rows men in dark suits shuffling papers. Across the aisle, the prosecutor assistant state's attorney, Carla Jennings, organized her files calmly. She was known for her precision in domestic violence cases and for never backing down against powerful defendants. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Judge Hamilton, stern and steady, adjusted his glasses and began the proceedings. "We are here for the matter of the state of Connecticut versus Sophia Dawson, charged with attempted murder in the first degree, and Richard and Margaret Dawson, charged with reckless endangerment in the first degree and neglect." The words hung heavy in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras in the back recorded every detail. Sophia shifted in her seat, her eyes darting briefly toward Lily before snapping back to the judge. The prosecution began with opening remarks. Jennings spoke clearly, her voice filling the courtroom without force. She described how Lily had been pushed down a flight of stairs during a public gala left bleeding, while her family dismissed the event as an accident. She emphasized the delay in calling emergency services, the threats made in the ICU, and the medical records that confirmed severe trauma. Jennings concluded, "This is not a case of misfortune. This is a case of premeditated violence followed by deliberate neglect." The defense attorney, Martin Kessler, rose and countered. He argued that the fall had been accidental, the result of sisters arguing, and an unfortunate misstep. He claimed the audio recordings were taken out of context, the video footage inconclusive, and the media coverage prejudicial. He insisted the court should not allow public outrage to dictate justice. When Jennings called her first witness, the room fell silent. Samuel Green stepped forward, his white coat replaced with a dark suit, his hands steady as he took the oath. He testified to the extent of Lily's injuries, the cardiac arrest in the ambulance, the declaration of death, and the revival. His voice was clinical but firm. For 8 seconds, Ms. Dawson was clinically deceased. That outcome was consistent with severe trauma and delayed emergency intervention. The courtroom gasped. Even the judge paused to write a note. Jennings then introduced the EMS report. A paramedic testified about arriving at the gala and being blocked momentarily by Richard Dawson, who insisted there was no emergency. The paramedic described Lily's condition upon arrival, her low Glasgow Coma Scale score, and the urgent measures taken. The legal weight was immense. Blocking access to emergency medical care constituted reckless endangerment under Connecticut law. Jennings then introduced the audio recording Lily had captured in the ICU. The judge allowed it, and the words filled the room. Margaret's cold warning not to speak Sophia's whisper about staying dead. The courtroom erupted in whispers until the judge silenced the room with his gavel. Sophia shifted in her chair, her face pale but defiant. Kessler objected, arguing the recording was unlawful. Jennings countered immediately, citing Connecticut's one-party consent statute. The judge ruled the recording admissible. Jennings looked directly at Sophia when she said, "The defendant's own words will speak louder than mine." After a recess, Jennings presented the surveillance footage from the gala. The screen flickered to life, showing Lily lying motionless on the marble, blood pooling while guests hovered. Sophia was visible brushing away a guest's hand who tried to help. Richard's voice could be heard in the background saying, "Do not call 911." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. One juror candidate in the gallery covered her mouth. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen. Sophia stared at the screen, her face blank but her hands trembling. During cross-examination, Kessler tried to frame Sophia's words as drunken banter, her gestures as misunderstood. But Sophia cracked. When pressed about the recording, she lost her composure and shouted, "I did not mean it like that. I just wanted her to stop making a scene." Her voice carried across the courtroom. Jennings seized the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the defendant admit that she wanted the victim silenced. This was not an accident. This was intentional." The judge noted the outburst for the record. The preliminary hearing was not a trial, but a determination of whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed. After days of testimony, Jennings summarized her case. "The state has presented medical audio and video evidence that the defendant Sophia Dawson pushed her sister with intent to cause serious harm, and that Richard and Margaret Dawson willfully endangered their daughter by denying her emergency care. The victim's survival is a miracle. Justice now demands accountability." The defense tried to salvage ground, requesting a plea deal to reduce charges to reckless assault, but Jennings refused. The judge deliberated briefly before speaking. "The evidence presented establishes probable cause. This matter will proceed to trial on all charges: attempted murder against Sophia Dawson, reckless endangerment and neglect against Richard and Margaret Dawson." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Sophia's composure cracked again, her voice trembling as she turned to her parents. "They cannot do this to us," she hissed. But Richard's face was gray. Margaret's lips pressed tight. For once, their influence meant nothing. As the gavel fell, Lily sat quietly in her seat, her body trembling but her spirit stronger. She had listened to her sister's voice echo through the courtroom, watched the video of her own blood staining the marble, and heard the judge confirm what she had always known but never thought would be recognized: her family had tried to erase her. Now the system would hold them accountable. Reporters surrounded her as she left the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones raised. She did not speak. She simply walked into the sunlight, her head high, the scar on her forehead gleaming like a brand of survival. The trial began on a brisk autumn morning in Hartford Superior Court. The courthouse was surrounded by a wall of cameras, satellite vans, and protesters demanding justice. Weeks had passed since the preliminary hearing, but public outrage had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown louder. National networks streamed live updates. Commentators debated not only the guilt of the Dawsons, but also what the case revealed about power and privilege. Inside the courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, advocates from domestic violence organizations, and ordinary citizens who wanted to witness what had begun as a private family crime become a public reckoning. Lily sat at the prosecution's table, flanked by victim advocates. She wore a simple black dress and a thin silver chain, the scar on her forehead visible. Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes never left the defense table where Sophia sat rigid, her jaw locked, her expensive suit immaculate, but her aura fraying. Richard and Margaret sat beside her, their faces masks of defiance mixed with fear. Judge Hamilton presided again, his presence calm but commanding. The jury of 12 men and women looked tense as the charges were read aloud: attempted murder in the first degree against Sophia Dawson, reckless endangerment and neglect against Richard and Margaret Dawson. The prosecution began with a stark opening statement. Assistant State's Attorney Carla Jennings walked to the center of the courtroom, her voice steady, her gaze sweeping across the jurors. She described the gala, the shove, the silence, the refusal to call for help. She spoke of the EMS report of Dr. Green's desperate resuscitation of Lily's heart stopping for 8 seconds. Jennings let the words hang before concluding, the victim was not just betrayed by her sister. She was abandoned by her entire family. The evidence will show this was not an accident. This was deliberate. Kessler, the defense attorney, countered by painting the night as a tragic misunderstanding. He described siblings arguing a slip on the stairs and a family panicking under pressure. He insisted the recordings and videos had been distorted by media frenzy. His closing line was practiced: do not let headlines convict where evidence does not. But the evidence came in waves. The prosecution called Dr. Green again. He testified clearly about the injuries, about cardiac arrest, about clinical death. The jurors leaned forward as he explained how a delay in emergency care could mean the difference between survival and brain death. Jennings displayed the CT scans and MRI images on large screens, the grainy outlines of fractured ribs and swelling brain tissue. The science was undeniable. Next came the paramedics. They described arriving at the gala the resistance from Richard Dawson, the critical condition of the patient, the Glasgow Coma Scale score of 6. They spoke of blood loss, shallow breathing, and the urgency of intubation. The jury scribbled notes, their faces pale. The recording was played again, filling the courtroom with Margaret's cold threat and Sophia's venomous words. Jurors flinched. The audio echoed against the marble walls, impossible to misinterpret. Jennings reminded them that Connecticut law permitted such recordings. Then came the surveillance footage. The jury watched as Lily fell as she lay motionless, as Sophia brushed away helping hands, as Richard barked orders not to call 911. Jennings froze the frame on Margaret sipping champagne, while her daughter bled in the background. "This is not panic," Jennings said. "This is indifference." The defense tried to challenge the video, suggesting angles obscured the truth, but the images were damning. The moment of collapse, the laughter, the delay were burned into the jury's memory. When Lily herself took the stand, the courtroom went silent. She spoke softly but firmly, recounting the night, the shove, the darkness, the voices above her as she slipped in and out of consciousness. She described waking in the ICU, hearing her mother's threats, her sister's words. She told them how she recorded it, how she documented her injuries, how she sent the evidence to a journalist because she knew her family would deny everything. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice did not waver when she said, "They tried to bury me. They called my life's work pathetic. They told me to stay dead. But I am here, and I will not be silenced." The courtroom absorbed every word. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. The jurors stared at her with empathy that no defense strategy could shake. During cross-examination, Kessler tried to suggest Lily had exaggerated, that she had misunderstood her sister's words, that her fall was an accident colored by family conflict. But Lily's calm replies dismantled his attempts. "I know what it feels like to be shoved," she said. "I know the sound of laughter while I bled, and I know the difference between an accident and intent." The prosecution introduced expert testimony on biomechanics. A forensic specialist explained how the trajectory of Lily's fall and the angle of impact were consistent with being pushed, not slipping. The details were technical but powerful. The jury nodded as diagrams were shown of staircases, forces, and injuries. Jennings then called Emily Carter. The nurse testified about the threats she overheard, about handing Lily the recorder, about photographing the injuries with time stamps. Her professionalism gave credibility to every word. She said softly, "I have treated many patients, but I have never seen a family more determined to silence their own daughter." The defense attempted to poke holes, claiming Emily had overstepped, but her integrity shone. The prosecution's case closed with David Miller, the journalist. He testified about receiving the files, verifying their authenticity, and publishing the article. He explained that he had verified the recordings with independent experts and cross-referenced the medical documents. His testimony showed that this was not media sensationalism, but corroborated truth. In rebuttal, the defense called character witnesses distant family friends who described Sophia as kind Richard, as generous Margaret, as devoted. But their words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The prosecution's closing argument was searing. Jennings reminded the jury of every image, every word, every act of cruelty. She ended with Lily's own declaration, "I died once. I came back, and I am here so that justice cannot be buried." The defense argued again that it was a family tragedy blown out of proportion, that intent could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But the jurors had seen too much. They had heard too much. The deliberations took less than a day. When the jury returned, the gallery was silent. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty of attempted murder in the first degree for Sophia Dawson. Guilty of reckless endangerment and neglect for Richard and Margaret Dawson. Gasps filled the courtroom. Sophia collapsed into her chair, her composure shattered. Margaret sobbed. Richard stared straight ahead. Lily closed her eyes, tears falling silently. The judge set sentencing for the following month and ordered Sophia taken into custody immediately. As deputies placed cuffs on her wrists, she screamed, "This is not fair!" But the courtroom did not waver. Reporters rushed outside, their voices rising in chaotic chorus. The verdict swept across the nation within minutes. Headlines blazed, "Connecticut heiress convicted of attempted murder of sister." Lily walked out of the courtroom, supported by Emily and David, the crowd outside chanting her name. She had faced the people who had abandoned her and watched them fall. The trial had ended. The reckoning was only beginning. The sentencing hearing was scheduled a month after the verdict, but the anticipation built like a storm. Every headline carried the story. Editorials debated whether the punishment would be harsh enough. Advocates for victims filled opinion pages insisting that a clear message had to be sent. For Lily, each passing day was a test of endurance. She returned home under police protection, still recovering physically, still haunted by nightmares of marble stairs and her sister's laughter. But she also found strength in letters that poured in from strangers, survivors, thanking her for speaking when they could not. By the morning of sentencing, the courthouse in Hartford was once again a fortress of cameras and protest signs. The air was cold sharp with anticipation. Lily walked through the crowd, escorted by advocates. She wore a simple gray coat, her face pale but resolute. Inside the courtroom was packed tighter than before. Survivors sat shoulder to shoulder, holding hands, silently demanding justice. Reporters whispered updates into microphones. The Dawsons sat at the defense table, their dynasty visibly crumbling. Sophia wore prison-issued clothing, no designer armor left to hide behind. Her hair was pulled back roughly, her eyes darting between her parents and the jury box, though there was no jury anymore. Margaret looked hollow, mascara smudged from sleepless nights. Richard stared ahead, his jaw clenched as though sheer defiance could change the outcome. Judge Hamilton entered, and the room rose. His voice was solemn as he opened the proceedings. "We are here today to impose sentence upon Sophia Dawson, convicted of attempted murder in the first degree, and Richard and Margaret Dawson, convicted of reckless endangerment and neglect. The court has reviewed the pre-sentence reports, the victim impact statements, and the submissions of counsel. We will now hear final statements before sentencing." Jennings spoke first, crisp and unflinching. She reminded the court of the deliberate shove, the 8 seconds of death, the weeks of neglect, the calculated cruelty. She urged the judge to impose a sentence that reflected not only the harm done to Lily, but also the danger posed when wealth is used as a shield against accountability. She concluded simply, "Anything less than full accountability tells every victim that their suffering is negotiable. The state asks for the maximum." Kessler, the defense attorney, rose next. He spoke of family tragedy, of emotions spiraling out of control, of reputations already destroyed. He begged the court for leniency, particularly for Margaret and Richard, framing them as parents who made mistakes rather than criminals. His words felt hollow in the echo of evidence already heard. When he finished, the judge invited the victim to speak. Lily stood slowly, every step deliberate. She held a folded sheet of paper but did not look at it. Her voice was steady, though it trembled at the edges. "I came into this courtroom once as a victim. Today, I stand as a survivor. I was shoved down a staircase by my sister. I lay on the floor bleeding while my parents laughed and drank. My heart stopped. I was declared dead, and when I fought my way back, they told me to stay silent, to stay gone. For years, I believed them when they said I was worthless. For years, I let their cruelty define me. But I am done being silent. They tried to bury me, but I rose. And I am asking this court to ensure that no one else suffers what I suffered. I ask not for revenge, but for justice. Her words hung heavy in the air. Even reporters lowered their pens for a moment. Sophia's eyes burned with a mixture of rage and shame while Margaret wept quietly. Richard's face remained carved from stone. The judge cleared his throat and spoke. The court must weigh both the crime and the impact. In this case, the crime is grave and the impact profound. The court finds no mitigating circumstances. Therefore, the sentence is as follows. For the defendant, Sophia Dawson, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, 25 years in the custody of the Connecticut Department of Corrections with no eligibility for parole for 15 years. Gasps filled the courtroom. Sophia's hands shook as deputies moved closer. The judge continued. For Richard and Margaret Dawson on charges of reckless endangerment and neglect, 10 years suspended sentence with 5 years of supervised probation. In addition, the defendants are hereby subject to a lifetime restraining order prohibiting any contact with the victim. The Dawsons shall also forfeit their roles in the family trust with financial management transferred to independent trustees. Margaret sobbed openly, collapsing into her chair. Richard clenched his fists but said nothing. Sophia screamed as deputies cuffed her wrists, shouting that she had been betrayed, that her family had abandoned her. The gallery did not flinch. Survivors nodded to one another, silent solidarity echoing louder than her protests. Reporters flooded out broadcasting the sentences within minutes. Headlines raced across the country. Heiress sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder of sister. Dawson parents found guilty of neglect. In living rooms from Connecticut to California, viewers shook their heads in disbelief and then in grim satisfaction. The consequences had landed. Outside the courthouse, protesters cheered when they heard the news. Hashtags surged again. Justice for Lily trended worldwide. Networks replayed the moment Lily stood to give her statement, her voice trembling but unbroken. Commentators praised her courage, her resilience, her defiance in the face of generational power. For the Dawson family, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Richard's businesses collapsed as partners withdrew and clients fled. Margaret was stripped from philanthropic boards she had once dominated. Sophia became a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with privilege, turned to cruelty. Their mansion in Connecticut became a symbol of disgrace, its gates surrounded by photographers capturing the decline. But for Lily, the sentencing brought something deeper. Relief washed over her, mingled with grief. She cried in Emily's arms after leaving the courthouse, not out of sorrow, but release. For the first time in her life, she had spoken and been heard. The law had believed her. The world had believed her. That night, the networks aired a special. One segment focused on Lily's transformation. It replayed her walking from the courthouse scar, glinting posture straight. A survivor no longer silent. Another segment showed community reaction. Teachers gathered in staff rooms across the country cheering her name. Survivors lit candles outside shelters in her honor. An anchor concluded, "This case will not only be remembered for its verdicts, but for the courage of one woman who refused to stay buried." The emotional weight lifted further when Lily received a letter from a child she had once tutored. The note, written in careful handwriting, read, "Thank you for being strong. Because of you, I know being hurt is not the end. It means I can get back up." Lily read it aloud to Emily and David, tears streaking her face. The sentencing was more than punishment. It was a turning point, proof that silence could be shattered, that justice could reach even into the heart of a wealthy family fortress. It did not erase her pain. It did not undo the years of cruelty. But it gave her something she had never possessed before: power. As she closed her eyes that night, the words of the judge echoed in her ears. 25 years, restriction, forfeiture, accountability. She whispered into the darkness, "They tried to take everything from me. Now they have nothing, and I have myself. the chapter of sentencing was complete. The consequences were real, public, irreversible. And for Lily, it was the moment she stopped merely surviving and began to live. 6 months passed after the sentencing, yet the echoes of that courtroom had not faded. For Lily Dawson, those months were filled with rebuilding. She carried scars that were visible and others that were buried deeper. But she also carried a new sense of purpose, something she had never known when trapped inside her family's shadow. On a crisp spring morning, Lily unlocked the doors of a modest brick building in Bridgeport. Above the entrance hung a simple sign, painted in bold letters, "Phoenix House for Survivors." It was her creation, built on the ashes of her old life. Inside were bright rooms filled with light shelves stacked with donated books, walls covered in art made by children. There were counseling offices, a legal aid corner staffed by volunteers, and a kitchen where survivors could share meals without fear. The place smelled of fresh paint and coffee. It felt alive. Emily Carter had left the hospital to join full-time serving as clinical director. David Miller acted as communications advisor, helping navigate the press and ensure transparency. Together, they formed the backbone of Lily's new family, one built not of blood, but of choice. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a small crowd of community leaders, teachers, and survivors. Reporters were present, but quieter now, their coverage more celebratory than sensational. Lily stood at the podium, a stack of note cards in her hand, but she barely glanced at them. Her voice was clear. "I was once told I was pathetic. I was once told to stay dead. I was once told that my pain was an embarrassment. But I am here, alive, and this house is for everyone who has ever been silenced. Here, no one is pathetic. Here, no one is told to disappear. Here, every story matters." The applause rose some people in tears. Survivors stepped forward to hug her. A mother whispered that her daughter finally had a safe place to go. A teenage boy quietly said thank you before slipping away, his eyes filled with relief. For Lily, these moments mattered more than headlines. They were proof that her suffering had been transformed into hope. The Phoenix House quickly partnered with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They received grants, training, and support. Lawyers offered pro bono hours. Counselors volunteered weekends. Within weeks, the waiting list grew, a testament to need. Lily worked long hours, but for the first time, the exhaustion was sweet. Each evening she left, knowing she had planted seeds of change. Meanwhile, the Dawson family unraveled. Sophia's appeal was denied. She began serving her sentence in York Correctional Institution, her once flawless reputation reduced to a number in the system. Margaret and Richard lived under the terms of their probation, isolated in their mansion, stripped of prestige. Former friends avoided them. Businesses collapsed. Their name had become a symbol of neglect. Reporters occasionally sought their comments, but they stayed silent, their influence gone. Lily did not rejoice at their fall. She simply noted it as consequence, the result of choices made without conscience. Her focus was on the future. One afternoon, while sorting through letters at Phoenix House, she found an envelope addressed in careful handwriting. Inside was a note from a young girl named Hannah. "Dear Miss Lily, my stepdad hurt my mom and me, but we found your center. I am not scared anymore because people believe me now. Thank you for making a place where we can breathe." Enclosed was a small drawing of a bird rising from flames, its wings spread wide. Lily pressed the paper to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. This was why she had survived. This was why she had fought. This was why she had testified, endured humiliation, and rebuilt her life. Justice in court had been important, but this was justice too. Healing, transformation, survival multiplied. She framed the drawing and hung it in the main hallway where every visitor could see it. Each time she passed, she whispered, "We rise." The months brought more victories. Phoenix House secured federal funding to expand literacy programs for survivors' children. Lily stood beside officials in Washington to announce the initiative, her scar visible under the camera's glare. Reporters asked if she was nervous. She replied, "I've already died once. Nothing frightens me now." The line made headlines, but in private moments, she was still human. She still woke some nights hearing Sophia's laughter, still felt the phantom push at her back when walking downstairs. Trauma clung stubbornly. Emily reminded her healing was not linear. David reminded her that surviving did not mean forgetting, and Lily reminded herself that courage meant continuing anyway. The story came full circle at a community event one summer evening. Survivors gathered in the courtyard of Phoenix House to share stories. Some were short, some were raw, some were whispered. At the end, a child stood nervously clutching a letter. It was a girl of 9, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "Dear Miss Lily, you told me once that pain is not the end. You told me that people will believe me. You were right. I am not afraid anymore." The crowd applauded gently. Lily felt her chest ache with pride. She saw in that child the reflection of her younger self, the girl once shoved into silence now mirrored by a girl who found her voice. When the evening ended, Lily lingered alone in the courtyard. The city hummed beyond the walls. She looked up at the stars and thought of all that had been lost and all that had been found. She whispered softly, "I died once, but I rose, and I will never let silence win again." The cameras of the world were no longer pointed at her, but the work continued. The ripples spread. Survivors found strength. Systems shifted. And somewhere inside a prison cell, Sophia was forced to face the emptiness left when cruelty no longer protected her. The balance had changed. Lily had rewritten the story. What began as a night of blood on marble had ended as a movement. The phoenix had risen and it carried countless others with it.